The Lancaster estate's smart glass windows had been programmed to filter the autumn light into something appropriately somber, casting everything in sepia tones that made the funeral reception look like a carefully curated hollow memory. Sophie Lancaster pressed her back against the mahogany shelves of the library, watching through the doorway as her family performed their grief for the assembled crowd of Neo-Boston's elite. Her neural implant chimed softly, another condolence message flooding the family's shared grief stream. She dismissed the notification without reading it, knowing it would be another variation of "Victoria was such a visionary" or "The Lancaster legacy will live on." The irony wasn't lost on her that even death had become a networking opportunity in 2087. Poor Sophie, still hiding in books. The whispered comment came from somewhere near the antique grandfather clock, its mechanical face an anachronism among the floating holographic displays showing Victoria's life highlights on endless loop. Sophie's enhanced hearing, a basic mod everyone got at 16, picked up every word despite the speaker's attempt at discretion. Victoria always worried about what would become of her. Thank goodness the rest of them turned out so well. Sophie turned a page of her vintage paper book, actual paper, not a neural download or holo reader, and let the familiar scent of old ink calm her racing pulse. The book was Marcus's Love in the Time of Cholera, a first edition she'd acquired 3 years ago for her private collection. The irony of reading about love while surrounded by people who'd never shown her any wasn't lost on her. Her reflection caught in the smart glass. 29 years old, wearing a simple black dress from the vintage shop on Beacon Hill, her dark hair pulled back in a basic knot. No designer neural jewelry, no status projections shimmering around her like the rest of the family. In a world where your net worth and social ranking could be displayed in real time above your head, Sophie had disabled all external broadcasts years ago. Privacy was a luxury in 2087, but anonymity was a choice. Through the doorway, she watched her cousin Vivian work the crowd like a quantum computer processing networking opportunities. Vivian's designer dress shifted colors subtly as she moved, responding to the emotional resonance of each conversation. Her holographic business card materialized beside anyone she spoke to for more than 30 seconds, complete with her credentials as Lancaster Properties' chief legal counsel and her husband's net worth. Sophie. She looked up to find her Uncle Charles standing in the library doorway, his grief stream projection showing the perfect amount of sorrow, quantified and displayed for public consumption. His bio-enhanced physique filled out his tailored suit perfectly, and his neural crown glinted silver at his temples, marking him as someone wealthy enough to afford the latest cognitive enhancements. Uncle Charles. She closed the book, keeping her finger between the pages. The reception seems to be going well. Your grandmother would have been pleased. His eyes swept over her simple attire, and she caught the micro-expression of disappointment he thought he was hiding. I wanted to let you know, we'll be holding the will reading next Wednesday. Family only, of course. Of course. Sophie stood, smoothing her skirt. The fabric was wool, not the adaptive smart fibre everyone else wore, another mark of her oddity. Charles moved deeper into the library, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone. But Sophie's hearing mods caught every nuance, every calculated inflection. I know Victoria had a soft spot for you, Sophie. We all did. But the business. He gestured toward the reception, where the holographic displays showed Victoria's real estate empire in all its glory. 50 million in assets, properties across 3 sectors of Neo-Boston, partnerships with the biggest tech conglomerates. The business needs real leadership now, vision, innovation. The subtext was clear, not you. I understand, Sophie said, and she did. She understood that Charles had already decided her fate, had probably run probability matrices on how to minimize any inheritance she might receive. She understood that to him, she was a problem to be solved, a loose end to be managed. Good. His relief was palpable. I know this transition will be difficult, but we'll make sure you're taken care of. Maybe enough to finally get yourself properly established. A real apartment, some modern amenities. Some charity, she translated silently. Enough to keep her quiet and grateful. That's very thoughtful, she said, her voice steady despite the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest. Charles patted her shoulder, a gesture that would have been kind if not for the calculation behind it, and returned to the reception. Sophie watched him navigate back to his wife Patricia, who was holding court near the memory wall, Victoria's achievements cycling through in high-definition glory. Patricia's laugh carried across the room, bright and sharp as breaking crystal. Her social media implant would be recording everything, cataloguing grief for her followers. In their world, even mourning was content to be optimized and monetized. Sophie returned to her chair and opened the book again, but the words blurred. Instead, she found herself remembering Victoria's last visit to the bookstore 6 months ago. Her grandmother had arrived without fanfare, no hovercar escort or security detail. Just Victoria, 83 years old and still sharp as quantum steel, wearing a simple coat and carrying a paper shopping bag. Still reading the old-fashioned way, Victoria had said, running her finger along the spines of Sophie's rare book collection. Some things don't need upgrading, Sophie had replied. Victoria had smiled at that, really smiled, not the political expression she wore at family gatherings. That's what I always loved about you, Sophie. You see value where others see obsolescence. Now, watching her family perform their synchronized mourning, Sophie wondered if Victoria had been trying to tell her something that day. The old woman had spent an hour browsing the shop, asking about Sophie's business, her writing, her life. She'd seemed especially interested in the rare book acquisition work Sophie had been quietly building. The most valuable things, Victoria had said before leaving, are often the ones people don't understand. The memory was interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. Sophie looked up to see Hunter, her other cousin, making his grand entrance. Even by family standards, Hunter was excessive. His biomods pushed right to the legal limit, his success stream broadcasting his latest property flip in real time above his head. At 28, he'd made his fortune buying up old Boston neighborhoods and converting them into high-tech lifestyle communities for the wealthy. Hunter's eyes found Sophie immediately, and his expression shifted to something that might have been pity if she didn't know better. He'd been trying to sleep with her for 3 years, ever since his divorce, treating her apparent availability as some kind of consolation prize. The fact that she kept turning him down seemed to genuinely confuse him. He approached with the confidence of someone whose neural enhancements included charisma boosters. "Sophie, there you are." His greeting was warm enough to fool casual observers, but Sophie caught the patronizing edge. "How are you holding up? This must be so difficult for you." "I'm fine, Hunter. Thank you." He settled into the chair across from her without invitation, his smart suit adjusting its color to complement the library's warm wood tones. Everything about Hunter was optimized, his appearance, his voice modulation, even his pheromone output. Sophie had learned to breathe shallowly around him. "Listen, I've been thinking." He leaned forward, his expression shifting to what his coaching AI probably labeled as sincere concern. "After the will reading, once everything's settled, maybe you should consider a change. I've got connections in the education sector, virtual learning systems, neural downloads. You could make real money, help real people." Translation: "Your current life is worthless, but I might be willing to fix you." "That's generous," Sophie said, "but I'm happy where I am." Hunter's smile faltered slightly. His emotional regulation software wasn't quite sophisticated enough to hide his frustration. "Sophie, come on. You're living above a bookstore. When's the last time you even updated your biomods? Your neural crown is at least 5 generations old." She touched the simple silver band at her temple, indeed several years behind current tech, but it served her needs perfectly. "It works fine." "But you could have so much more." He gestured toward the reception. Look at what the family's accomplished. Vivian's law practice, my development projects, even Patricia's social media empire. We're all part of something bigger. And you're not, hung unspoken in the air between them. I suppose we all have different definitions of accomplishment, Sophie said. Something in her tone must have registered, because Hunter's flirtation algorithms kicked in. His voice dropped to what he probably thought was a seductive register. You know, after all this is over, maybe we could grab dinner. I know you've always been selective, but I think we could be good together. I could show you things, introduce you to people. The offer was so patronizing, it took her breath away. Hunter thought he was doing her a favor, offering to elevate her from her pathetic existence into his glittering world. The fact that she might not want what he was offering never seemed to occur to him. That's very kind, she said, but I don't think we're compatible. His charm mod flickered for just a moment, revealing genuine irritation underneath. Sophie, be practical. When's the last time you even dated anyone? You can't hide in books forever. Before she could respond, Patricia's voice cut across the room like a laser scalpel. Sophie! There you are, darling. Her aunt approached with the predatory grace of someone whose every movement was calculated for maximum social impact. Patricia's bio-enhancements were more subtle than Hunter's, but no less extensive. Skin that looked 30 at 54, eyes that sparkled with artificial luminescence. A voice modulated to the perfect pitch for influence and manipulation. Hunter, you're monopolizing our little bookworm. Patricia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Sophie, dear, you simply must come meet the Ashfords. They own that lovely chain of virtual reality cafes. I was just telling them about your quaint little bookshop. The dismissiveness was expertly calibrated, enough to seem supportive to casual observers, while making it clear that Sophie's work was a charming anachronism at best. I should stay here, Sophie said. Someone should keep watch over grandmother's books. Oh, sweetheart. Patricia's laugh tinkled like expensive wind chimes. Those old things will be fine. Besides, we'll probably donate them to a museum or something. No one really needs physical books anymore. The casual dismissal of Victoria's beloved collection hit Sophie like a physical blow. These were rare first editions, some of them centuries old, each one carefully chosen and preserved. To Patricia, they were just clutter taking up space that could be better used for networking. I'm sure someone will appreciate them, Sophie managed. Of course. Tax write-off too. Patricia's business smile never wavered. Now come along. The Ashfords are very interested in historical curiosities. The phrase stung exactly as it was meant to. Sophie looked down at her vintage dress, her paper book, her simple life, and saw herself through Patricia's eyes. A historical curiosity herself, quaint and ultimately irrelevant. She stood anyway, because refusing would create a scene, and scenes drew attention Sophie couldn't afford. Not yet. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and condescending conversations. She met tech moguls who found her bookstore absolutely charming, like a time capsule, and socialites who marveled that people still read physical books for pleasure, not just historical research. Each interaction was a small humiliation, delivered with smiles and wrapped in false kindness. Through it all, Sophie played her part, the family eccentric, harmless, and slightly pitiable. She answered their questions about rare books and vintage literature, endured their amazement that she lived so simply in an age of endless possibility. She even managed to smile when Mrs. Ashford offered to help her get established in something more modern. But inside, she was calculating. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing offer of assistance, every assumption about her capabilities and worth, she filed them all away. Not for revenge exactly, but for context. For the moment when context would matter. As the evening wound down, Sophie found herself back in the library, helping the catering staff clear away glasses and plates. It was automatic, this instinct to serve, to make herself useful in small, invisible ways. She'd been doing it her entire life. "There's our little Cinderella." Vivian appeared in the doorway, her adaptive dress now a deep midnight blue that made her eyes look almost luminous. Her husband Marcus stood beside her, his investment banker credentials floating discreetly above his left shoulder. Net worth, success rating, social influence score all hovering at impressive levels. "Still cleaning up after everyone?" Vivian continued. "You know, Sophie, the staff can handle that. Your family." The words were kind, but the tone suggested otherwise. Vivian's expression was the carefully neutral mask of someone addressing a beloved but problematic relative. Fond condescension mixed with genuine concern about what others might think. "I don't mind helping," Sophie said, stacking empty plates with practiced efficiency. "Of course you don't." Marcus's voice carried the particular blend of amusement and pity that wealthy people used when discussing those less fortunate. "Sophie's always been service-oriented. Haven't you, Sophie?" The question was a trap loaded with implications. Say yes, and she was admitting to being naturally subservient. Say no, and she seemed ungrateful for her family's tolerance of her eccentricities. "I believe in contributing where I can," she said instead. Vivian and Marcus exchanged a look, the kind of quick, silent communication that couples developed when discussing difficult topics in public. "Well," Vivian said finally, "after Wednesday, you'll have more opportunities to contribute. Charles mentioned he's thinking of setting up a small trust for you. Nothing dramatic, you understand, but enough to expand your options." Translation: enough to keep you quiet and grateful, but not enough to embarrass us. "That's very generous," Sophie said, the same response she'd given everyone all evening. "We take care of family," Marcus said, his success stream flickering with what his AI probably classified as magnanimous leadership. "Even when family doesn't quite fit the traditional mold." Sophie nodded and smiled and played her part until they finally left her alone with the dishes and the silence. When the last guest had gone and the smart glass had returned to its normal transparency, she stood in the empty library and allowed herself one moment of pure, unadulterated rage. They thought they knew her. They thought they understood her worth, her capabilities, her place in their carefully ordered world. They saw her simple clothes and simple apartment and simple life and concluded that she was simple too, grateful for their charity, content with their scraps, harmless as a pet. If they only knew. Sophie pulled out her neural crown's private interface and accessed a secure partition that even the best hackers couldn't breach. A holographic display materialized in the air before her, visible only to her retinal implants. Midnight Literary Acquisitions, LLC in current assets, $47.2 million. Active acquisitions, 1,847. Pending sales, $12.8 million. The numbers glowed softly in the darkness, a secret empire built on knowledge and patience while her family chased headlines and status updates. She'd started the business 8 years ago with a $500 loan and an eye for undervalued manuscripts. Now she owned one of the most successful rare book acquisition firms on the East Coast, with clients ranging from private collectors to major museums. The bookstore was real, her apartment was real, her simple life was real, but they were also the perfect camouflage. While her family performed their wealth for an audience of millions, Sophie had quietly built something that actually mattered. She closed the display and picked up her vintage Marquez, running her fingers over the worn cover. Next Wednesday would come whether she was ready or not. The will reading, the family's final performance of grief, the careful division of Victoria's empire among the worthy heirs. They had no idea what was coming. Outside, Neo Boston glittered with 1 million holographic advertisements and status projections, the city itself a testament to humanity's need to broadcast success and happiness to the world. Sophie turned off the library lights and made her way toward the door, her footsteps silent on the antique Persian rug. In 7 days, everything would change. But tonight, she was still their little Cinderella, cleaning up after the ball, invisible and underestimated. It was exactly where she wanted to be. The hovercar's navigation system chimed politely as it descended toward the Lancaster estate, the Sunday evening traffic flowing in perfect algorithmic harmony around them. Sophie watched through the transparent aluminum windows as Neo-Boston's skyline shifted from the gleaming towers of the financial district to the carefully preserved historical facades of Beacon Hill. Her reflection looked back at her from the car's smart glass. The same vintage dress she'd worn to the funeral, the same simple silver neural crown, the same complete absence of status projections or wealth displays. In the 6 months since Victoria's death, nothing about her appearance had changed. Everything else, however, had been moving according to plan. The estate came into view, its smart architecture adapting to the evening light, windows glowing warm and welcoming. Charles and Patricia were hosting their traditional Sunday dinner, a Lancaster family institution that had survived 3 generations of technological revolution. Tonight would be different, though. Tonight was the final gathering before Wednesday's will reading. Sophie's neural implant chimed with an incoming message from her business partner in London, another successful acquisition, this one a collection of Virginia Woolf manuscripts that would triple in value once the authentication was complete. She archived the message without responding. Midnight literary acquisitions would have to wait. The hovercar settled onto the estate's landing pad with barely a whisper of displaced air. Sophie gathered her vintage leather bag, the same one she'd carried to every family gathering for 5 years, and stepped out into the crisp October evening. The front door recognized her biometrics and slid open silently, revealing the familiar grandeur of the Lancaster foyer. Holographic family portraits cycled through the air, 3 generations of Lancasters displaying their wealth and achievements in carefully curated loops. Victoria's memorial display still held the place of honor, her life's work shimmering in midair like a digital monument. Sophie, right on time. Patricia emerged from the direction of the kitchen, her bio-enhanced figure perfectly displayed in a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly housing allowance. At 54, she looked barely 30 thanks to the latest regenerative treatments, her smile as bright and sharp as surgical steel. Patricia. Sophie accepted the air kiss her aunt offered, noting the subtle way Patricia positioned herself to ensure any observers would see her being gracious to the family's lesser member. You look exactly the same. Patricia's tone managed to make consistency sound like a character flaw. Still shopping vintage, I see. How wonderfully authentic. The word authentic came out sounding vaguely unsanitary. I like what I like, Sophie said. Of course you do. Well, come along. Charles is in the main salon with the others. We're having such a lovely evening. Vivian brought Marcus, and Hunter just closed another development deal. 8 figures, can you imagine? Sophie could imagine. She'd been tracking Hunter's business dealings through public records and financial filings for months. His latest project was impressive, though built on a foundation of questionable loans and leveraged buyouts that wouldn't survive a serious economic downturn. They entered the main salon, where the rest of the family had already assembled. The room's smart glass offered a panoramic view of the city, and the furniture had been programmed to optimal comfort settings for each guest. Everything was perfectly calculated to project success and sophistication. Charles stood near the bar, his enhanced physique filling out his casual suit perfectly. His neural crown caught the light as he turned to greet her, his expression managing to convey both fondness and gentle disappointment. Sophie! He crossed the room to embrace her, the gesture warm enough to seem genuine. Thank you for coming. I know these gatherings can be overwhelming. Not at all, Sophie said. Family is important. Indeed it is. Charles's voice carried just a hint of the authority he wielded in the boardroom, especially during transitions like this. Victoria's passing has left us all reassessing our priorities. Across the room, Vivian looked up from her conversation with Marcus. Her adaptive dress shimmered from deep green to golden amber as she moved, responding to her emotional state with micro-adjustments in colour and texture. She'd inherited Victoria's cheekbones and Charles's business acumen, plus a law degree from Harvard Neural and a husband worth $40 million. Sophie! Vivian's greeting was warm enough to seem genuine if you didn't know her tells. I was just telling Marcus about your little bookstore. He's fascinated by the idea of physical books. Marcus nodded politely, his investment credentials floating discreetly above his shoulder. It's like stepping back in time, isn't it? Very educational. The subtext was clear, quaint, harmless, irrelevant to modern life. Some people find it nostalgic, Sophie agreed. I imagine it must be quite peaceful, Marcus continued, working with historical artifacts instead of dealing with real-world pressures. Real-world pressures. Sophie almost smiled at that. If Marcus only knew about the 18-hour days she'd spent authenticating the Byzantine manuscript collection last month, or the nerve-wracking negotiations with the Vatican's digital archives, or the 3 separate federal investigations she'd helped resolve by providing documentation for stolen cultural artifacts. It has its moments, she said instead. Hunter chose that moment to make his entrance, sweeping into the salon with the kind of confidence that could only come from a 30% increase in neural processing power and a guaranteed trust fund. His biomods had been updated since the funeral. His jawline was sharper, his eyes more luminous, his presence calculated to maximum impact. Family! His voice boomed across the room, enhanced by vocal modulators that added just the right amount of warmth and authority. Sorry I'm late. Just finished closing the waterfront district deal. He moved through the room like a politician at a campaign rally, embracing Charles with back-slapping enthusiasm, kissing Patricia's cheek with theatrical gallantry, and acknowledging Vivian and Marcus with the casual confidence of an equal among equals. Then his eyes found Sophie. And there's our resident scholar. His smile was genuine, or at least projected genuine, with enough sophistication to fool most observers. Sophie, you look timeless. It wasn't quite an insult, but it wasn't quite a compliment either. Timeless could mean classic and elegant, or it could mean stuck in the past and refusing to evolve. Hunter's expression suggested he meant both. Thank you, Sophie said, because it was easier than passing the layers of condescension. I was just thinking about our conversation at the funeral, Hunter continued, settling into the chair next to hers with practiced casualness. About expanding your horizons. I've got some ideas that might interest you. Hunter. Patricia's voice carried just enough warning to be noticeable. Let's not talk business until after dinner. Tonight should be about family. Of course. Hunter's smile never wavered, but Sophie caught the flash of annoyance in his eyes. Patricia had just reminded him that business discussions were for equals, and Sophie wasn't quite equal enough to warrant serious consideration. Charles moved to the bar and began mixing drinks with the kind of ritualistic precision that suggested long practice. What can I get everyone? Sophie, still drinking that herbal tea. Please. Coming right up, Hunter the usual. As Charles worked, Sophie watched the family settle into their familiar dynamics. Patricia held court near the window, her social media implants recording everything for her followers. Vivian and Marcus discussed market projections in voices just loud enough to remind everyone of their financial acumen. Hunter lounged in his chair like a king holding court, his success stream broadcasting his latest achievements in soft golden light. And Sophie sat quietly in the corner, invisible as furniture, listening to everything. I have to say, Patricia announced, turning from the window with her drink in hand, I'm looking forward to Wednesday. Not the sadness of it, of course, but the closure. Victoria would have wanted us to move forward. Absolutely, Charles agreed, handing Sophie her tea. She built something remarkable, and it's our responsibility to honour that legacy. 8-figure development deals, Hunter added, with barely concealed satisfaction. Museum partnerships. International law practice. She'd be proud of what we've accomplished. Sophie sipped her tea and said nothing. Around her, the family began their familiar performance, the careful cataloguing of their achievements, the subtle competition for status, the ongoing negotiation of hierarchy and influence. Of course, Vivian said, her voice carefully neutral, we'll all need to adjust to the new reality. The business will require restructuring, new leadership strategies. Natural transitions, Charles nodded. Victoria understood that. She was always practical about succession planning. They were talking around the elephant in the room, Sophie realised. None of them wanted to discuss the will directly. That would be crass, unseemly. But they were all thinking about it, calculating their expected shares, planning their post-inheritance lives. What about you, Sophie? Marcus asked suddenly. Any thoughts about the future? Plans for expansion? The question was polite enough, but Sophie heard the subtext. Do you have any realistic expectations, or are you prepared to be grateful for whatever scraps we throw your way? I'm content with my work, she said. Some things don't need to scale up to have value. How wonderfully zen, Patricia laughed, the sound bright and sharp. Though I suppose we all can't build empires. Someone has to appreciate the smaller pleasures in life. Smaller pleasures. Sophie's neural implant chimed with a priority message. The British Museum wanted to discuss her acquisition of a previously unknown Shakespeare sonnet. The authentication alone would net her firm $3 million, not counting the sale premium. I find meaning in what I do, Sophie said simply. Of course you do, darling. Patricia's voice was warm with what someone might mistake for affection. And we're so proud of you for finding your niche. Not everyone is cut out for high-pressure business development. Hunter leaned forward in his chair, his enhanced charisma radiating like a low-level electromagnetic field. But Sophie, don't you ever wonder what you could accomplish with more resources? Backing? I mean, that bookstore is charming, but imagine what you could do with real capital investment. I'm not looking for investors, Sophie said. Maybe not traditional investors, Hunter persisted, but family investment, support, guidance. I've been thinking after Wednesday, once everything's settled, maybe we could discuss some opportunities. Real estate development has a lot of moving parts, and some of those parts involve cultural assets, historical preservation, that kind of thing. The offer was simultaneously generous and insulting. Hunter was proposing to hire her as a consultant on the cultural aspects of his development projects, a way to make use of her expertise while keeping her firmly in a subordinate role. That's very thoughtful, Sophie said, but I'm happy with my current work. Hunter's smile flickered for just a moment. Sophie, come on, be practical. When's the last time you updated your biomods? Your neural crown is so old it's practically vintage itself. The laughter that followed wasn't quite mean-spirited, but it wasn't kind either. Sophie was used to being the family's amusing anachronism, the eccentric cousin who clung to outdated technology and outdated ways of thinking. Some things work better when they're not constantly upgraded, she said mildly. Like books? Vivian asked, her tone suggesting gentle indulgence. I suppose there's something to be said for consistency. The conversation moved on, flowing around Sophie like water around a stone. They discussed Charles's latest property acquisitions, Patricia's growing social media empire, Vivienne's high-profile cases, Hunter's development projects. Each achievement was carefully catalogued and celebrated, each success adding another layer to the family's collective narrative of prosperity and influence. Sophie listened to all of it, filing away details and connections, building a mental map of their current financial positions and business relationships. Not out of malice, but out of habit. Information was her business, and she'd learned long ago that the most valuable information often came from casual conversations. "Dinner," Patricia announced, clapping her hands with theatrical enthusiasm. "I had the kitchen prepare something special tonight. Molecular gastronomy, the latest thing from that wonderful restaurant in Neo-Tokyo." They moved to the dining room, where the table had been set with holographic place cards and smart utensils that would analyze and optimize each bite for individual nutritional requirements. Sophie found herself seated between Hunter and Marcus, directly across from an empty chair that had once been Victoria's. The meal was a masterpiece of modern culinary technology, each dish engineered at the molecular level to provide optimal nutrition, while delivering complex flavors that shifted and evolved with each bite. Sophie ate politely and made appropriate conversation while calculating the cost. Probably more than most families spent on food in a year. "This is remarkable," Marcus said, examining his fork's readout. 97% absorption efficiency, perfect macronutrient balance, and the flavor profiles are extraordinary. "Only the best for family," Charles said with satisfaction. "Life's too short for inferior experiences." Sophie thought about the simple sandwich she'd eaten for lunch at her desk while negotiating the acquisition of a collection of Emily Dickinson letters. The sandwich had cost $3 and tasted like happiness. "Sophie, you're very quiet tonight," Patricia observed. "Not enjoying the food?" "It's delicious," Sophie said truthfully. The food was objectively perfect, engineered to be delicious. But there was something sterile about perfection, something that made her miss the imperfect joy of cooking for herself. "She's probably thinking about books," Hunter said with fond condescension. "Always lost in some story or another, aren't you, Sophie?" "Stories have their place," Sophie agreed. "Of course they do. Entertainment, escapism. But at some point we all have to engage with reality." Hunter's enhanced charisma was turned up to maximum, his voice warm with what seemed like genuine concern. "I worry about you sometimes, hiding away in that shop. When's the last time you really lived, travelled, experienced something new?" The question hit closer to home than Sophie cared to admit. When had she last travelled for pleasure rather than business? When had she last done something purely for joy? Her last vacation had been 3 years ago, a weekend in Vermont that she'd spent reading by a lake. But she'd also spent the last 3 years building something extraordinary. While her family performed their lives for public consumption, she'd created an empire of knowledge and culture that touched museums, universities, and private collections across 6 continents. "I find my work fulfilling," she said. "Work isn't everything," Vivian offered gently. "There's also love, family, personal connections. Don't you ever want more?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, her family waited for her response with expressions of concerned affection. They were genuinely worried about her, Sophie realized. In their world of constant stimulation and endless possibility, her simple life looked like poverty. They couldn't understand that she'd chosen this simplicity, that she'd built her success specifically to avoid their kind of performance. They saw her refusing their values and concluded she was incapable of achieving them. "I'm content," Sophie said finally. "Content." Patricia repeated the word like she was tasting something unfamiliar. How wonderfully peaceful. The conversation moved on to safer topics. Charles's latest charity commitments, Patricia's upcoming media appearances, Vivian's promotion to senior partner. Sophie listened and responded when spoken to, playing her part in the family's carefully orchestrated dinner theatre. As the evening wound down, she helped clear the table despite Patricia's protests that the staff can handle that. It was automatic behavior, this instinct to be useful, to contribute in small ways that wouldn't threaten anyone's sense of hierarchy. "There she goes again," Hunter said fondly as Sophie stacked plates. "Our little domestic goddess. You know, Sophie, after Wednesday, you should think about hiring some help for the shop. A maid service, maybe. You deserve to be taken care of for once. The comment was meant kindly, but Sophie heard the assumptions underneath. That she cleaned because she had to, not because she chose to. That her simple life was the result of financial limitation rather than personal preference. That being taken care of was something she deserved rather than something she'd already achieved for herself. I like taking care of things myself, she said. Of course you do. Patricia's voice was warm with maternal affection. You've always been so self-sufficient. It's admirable, really, even if it's not necessary anymore. Not necessary anymore, because after Wednesday, she'd have her small inheritance and wouldn't need to work so hard, because the family would take care of her, provide for her, make sure she was comfortable in her little corner of their expanding empire. Sophie smiled and nodded and continued clearing dishes while her family discussed their post-inheritance plans in careful hypotheticals. None of them mentioned specific amounts or asked what she expected to receive. That would be gauche, unseemly. But she could feel their calculations, their assumptions, their gentle certainty that she'd be grateful for whatever crumbs fell from their table. 3 more days until the will reading. 3 more days of being invisible, underestimated, dismissed as a charming anachronism in a family of high-achieving modernists. Sophie carried the dishes to the kitchen and began loading the dishwasher with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything in her life. Through the window, she could see Neo-Boston's skyline glittering with the dreams and ambitions of 8 million people, all of them broadcasting their successes to the world. I like taking care of things myself, she said. Of course you do. Patricia's voice was warm with maternal affection. You've always been so self-sufficient. It's admirable, really, even if it's not necessary anymore. Not necessary anymore, because after Wednesday, she'd have her small inheritance and wouldn't need to work so hard, because the family would take care of her, provide for her, make sure she was comfortable in her little corner of their expanding empire. Sophie smiled and nodded and continued clearing dishes while her family discussed their post-inheritance plans in careful hypotheticals. None of them mentioned specific amounts or asked what she expected to receive. That would be gauche, unseemly. But she could feel their calculations, their assumptions, their gentle certainty that she'd be grateful for whatever crumbs fell from their table. 3 more days until the will reading. 3 more days of being invisible, underestimated, dismissed as a charming anachronism in a family of high-achieving modernists. Sophie carried the dishes to the kitchen and began loading the dishwasher with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything in her life. Through the window, she could see Neo-Boston's skyline glittering with the dreams and ambitions of 8 million people, all of them broadcasting their successes to the world. In 3 days, her family would discover that the quietest person in the room had been building the loudest success of all. She was looking forward to their surprise. The evening had settled into its familiar rhythm of calculated conversation and competitive displays of success when the estate's security system chimed with an unexpected arrival. Charles paused mid-sentence, his enhanced hearing picking up the distinctive whine of a high-end hover vehicle touching down on the landing pad. "Are we expecting someone else?" Patricia's voice carried a note of annoyance. Unplanned arrivals disrupted the careful choreography of family gatherings, and Patricia despised disruption. Charles checked his neural interface, his expression shifting from confusion to professional alertness. "It's Alexander Hartwell, my business partner." He stood, smoothing his jacket with unconscious precision. "I apologize. He said he might stop by if his flight from Geneva arrived early. Marquez." Alexander's smile was genuine, unguarded in a way that made Sophie's chest tighten unexpectedly. "A romantic. And what's your take on Florentino's 50-year pursuit? Admirable devotion or pathetic obsession?" The question hit Sophie like a neural shock. No one in her family had ever asked her opinion on literature. Books were her little hobby. her eccentric interests that explained why she couldn't quite fit into their world of practical success. But Alexander was waiting for her answer with the kind of attention that suggested he actually cared what she thought. "That's the beautiful complexity of it," Sophie said, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing. "Society would call him pathetic, a poor telegraph operator pining for a doctor's wife. But Marquez shows us that real wealth isn't what you own, it's what you're capable of feeling. Florentino was richer in love than any of the respectable characters." Alexander leaned closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Florentino waited 50 years for love," he murmured, his voice low enough that she could feel his breath against her ear. "Most people would call that pathetic." The proximity sent an unexpected shiver through Sophie's nervous system. Her neural implants registered elevated heart rate, increased skin conductivity, dilated pupils, all the biological markers of attraction that she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to admit. "Most people," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "confuse patience with passivity." Florentino wasn't waiting, he was preparing, building himself into someone worthy of the love he'd found. Alexander's pupils dilated visibly, and Sophie realized that her response had affected him just as much as his proximity had affected her. Around the table, the family's dinner conversation had faded to uncomfortable silence as they watched this unexpected interaction unfold. "That's—" Alexander paused, seeming to search for words. "That's an incredibly insightful reading. Most people focus on the melodrama and miss the underlying philosophy about the nature of devotion." "Sophie's always been very analytical," Hunter interjected, his enhanced charisma working overtime to inject himself back into the conversation. "She tends to overthink things. Classic academic mindset, you know." The comment was meant to diminish, to reduce Sophie's literary insight to mere intellectual showboating. Hunter's neural crown flickered as his social optimization algorithms calculated the best approach to regain Alexander's attention. But Alexander didn't even look at Hunter. His gaze remained fixed on Sophie with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen at the same time. "Overthinking," Alexander repeated, as if the concept amused him. "Is that what we're calling intelligence now?" The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Hunter's enhanced smile faltered for just a moment before his emotional regulation software kicked in to smooth the expression back to confident charm. "Of course not," Hunter laughed, the sound hitting precisely the right notes of self-deprecation and masculine confidence. "I just meant that Sophie sometimes gets lost in the theoretical aspects instead of focusing on the practical applications. When's the last time you actually dated someone, Soph? Maybe it's time to stop analyzing fictional love stories and start living a real one." The attack was perfectly calibrated, disguised as playful teasing but designed to highlight Sophie's romantic failures while positioning Hunter as the obvious solution to her loneliness. Around the table, Sophie could feel the family's collective wince at Hunter's bluntness, but also their tacit agreement with his assessment. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar burn of public humiliation. Hunter had just reduced her to the stereotype they all carried in their minds, the spinster librarian, hiding from real life behind books and theories. But before she could formulate a response, Alexander spoke. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a note of steel beneath the cultivated politeness, "I think Sophie understands love better than most people. It takes real confidence to value substance over appearance, depth over superficiality. That's—" He paused, his eyes finding Sophie's again. "That's incredibly attractive." The words hit the room like a quantum bomb. Patricia's social media algorithms stumbled over how to process this development. Vivian's legal training kicked in, analyzing the sudden shift in social dynamics. Marcus's investment instincts recognized the sound of established hierarchies being disrupted, And Hunter's bio-enhanced features couldn't quite mask his shock at having his calculated attack turned against him so effortlessly. "Well," Patricia said after a moment, her voice bright with forced cheer, "how lovely to meet someone who appreciates Sophie's unique perspective." Unique perspective. The phrase was meant to contain the damage, to suggest that Alexander's interest was an amusing quirk rather than a genuine threat to their established order. But Alexander was still looking at Sophie like she was the only person in the room worth his attention. "Tell me about your work," he said. "Charles mentioned you're involved in rare book acquisition. That must be fascinating." The question was a lifeline, an invitation to step out of the role of family oddity and into her professional identity. Sophie felt some of her equilibrium returning. "I help collectors and institutions locate historically significant manuscripts," she said. "Authentication, acquisition, preservation. There's a whole underground market for literary artifacts that most people never see." Underground market? Alexander's smile was appreciative. "That sounds deliciously mysterious, like literary archaeology. Something like that." Sophie found herself smiling back, the expression feeling foreign after an evening of careful neutrality. "Though the real treasure hunting happens in estate sales and forgotten archives, you'd be amazed what people throw away without realizing its value." "I imagine you would be." Alexander's voice carried layers of meaning that Sophie couldn't quite pass. The ability to recognize value where others see worthlessness, that's a rare skill. "It's just research," Sophie said, though something in his tone suggested he was talking about more than books. "Research?" Alexander seemed to taste the word. "Is that what you call it when you identified that collection of Hemingway manuscripts last year? The ones that sold for, what was it, 2.3 million? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Around the table, Sophie could feel her family's collective attention sharpening, their casual dismissal of her work suddenly requiring reassessment. How did he know about the Hemingway deal? That transaction had been handled through her business entity, Midnight Literary Acquisitions, with carefully maintained anonymity for both buyer and seller. The only people who knew about her involvement were her business partner in London and the authentication team at Harvard's Manuscript Laboratory. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "The Hemingway manuscripts," Alexander continued, his tone conversational but his eyes watchful. "Previously unknown material from his time in Key West. Your company handled the acquisition and authentication, didn't it? Brilliant work, from what I heard. The literary world is still buzzing about it." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Across the table, Vivian was staring at her with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for cross-examining hostile witnesses. "Sophie?" Charles's voice carried a note of confusion. "What is he talking about? What company?" The moment stretched like a quantum entanglement, probability waves collapsing into a single, unavoidable reality. Sophie could feel the carefully constructed barriers between her public and private lives beginning to crumble. She began, then stopped. Around the table, her family waited with the kind of predatory patience that came from sensing weakness. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry." I assumed it was common knowledge within the family. Sophie Lancaster, proprietor of Midnight Literary Acquisitions, one of the most successful rare manuscript firms on the East Coast. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the estate's ambient systems seemed to pause, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Hunter was the first to break. "What? Sophie, what the hell is he talking about?" "Language, Hunter," Patricia said automatically, but her voice was distant, distracted. Her neural crown was flickering as she ran rapid searches on Midnight Literary Acquisitions and Sophie Lancaster. "That's impossible," Vivian said, her legal training kicking in. "Sophie works at a bookstore." "She lives above a bookstore. She owns the bookstore," Alexander interrupted gently. and the building it's housed in, and 3 other properties in the historic district, if I'm not mistaken. Sophie watched her family's faces cycle through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and dawning recognition. Their entire understanding of her place in the world was being systematically dismantled by a man they'd known for less than an hour. Sophie, Charles's voice was carefully controlled, is this true? She could lie, she could deflect, minimize, explain away Alexander's knowledge as a misunderstanding or case of mistaken identity. She'd spent years perfecting the art of invisible success, of building an empire while letting everyone assume she was struggling to pay rent. But Alexander was looking at her with something that might have been encouragement, and for the first time in her adult life, Sophie was tired of hiding. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true." "Holy shit!" Hunter breathed, his vocal modulators failing to disguise his shock. "Sophie, you're telling us you own a multi-million-dollar business?" "I'm telling you, I work in rare manuscript acquisition and authentication," Sophie said. "The financial details aren't really relevant to family dinner." But they were relevant, and everyone at the table knew it. In their world of quantified success and broadcast achievements, financial details were the only details that mattered. "How?" Vivian's question came out sharper than she probably intended. "How is this possible? You never said anything. You live in a studio apartment. You drive that ancient Honda." "I live simply because I choose to," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "And I don't broadcast my business because I prefer privacy to performance." The comment hit its target. Around the table, her family, all of whom built their identities around public displays of success, absorbed the implicit criticism. Alexander was watching the interplay with obvious fascination, like an anthropologist studying some previously unknown social ritual. "This is remarkable," Marcus said, his investment banker instincts finally engaging. "Sophie, what kind of volume are we talking about? Annual revenue? Asset portfolio?" "Marcus," Vivienne warned, but her husband's financial curiosity was fully activated. "No, this is important," Marcus continued. "If Sophie's been operating at this level without anyone knowing, that suggests either extraordinary discretion or extraordinary success," Alexander finished smoothly. "The kind that doesn't need to advertise itself." He turned to Sophie, his expression warm with something that looked dangerously like admiration. "Beauty, brains, and business acumen," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that seemed to vibrate through Sophie's neural pathways. "That's a dangerous combination." The sexual tension in the room became so thick that even Patricia's social optimization algorithms seemed to short-circuit. Vivian actually blushed, her adaptive dress shifting from golden amber to deep rose in response to her emotional state. "The Hemingway manuscripts," Alexander continued, his tone conversational but his eyes watchful. "Previously unknown material from his time in Key West. Your company handled the acquisition and authentication, didn't it? Brilliant work, from what I heard. The literary world is still buzzing about it." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. Across the table, Vivian was staring at her with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for cross-examining hostile witnesses. "Sophie?" Charles's voice carried a note of confusion. "What is he talking about? What company?" The moment stretched like a quantum entanglement, probability waves collapsing into a single, unavoidable reality. Sophie could feel the carefully constructed barriers between her public and private lives beginning to crumble. She began, then stopped. Around the table, her family waited with the kind of predatory patience that came from sensing weakness. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry." I assumed it was common knowledge within the family. Sophie Lancaster, proprietor of Midnight Literary Acquisitions, one of the most successful rare manuscript firms on the East Coast. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the estate's ambient systems seemed to pause, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Hunter was the first to break. "What? Sophie, what the hell is he talking about?" "Language, Hunter," Patricia said automatically, but her voice was distant, distracted. Her neural crown was flickering as she ran rapid searches on midnight literary acquisitions and Sophie Lancaster. "That's impossible," Vivian said, her legal training kicking in. "Sophie works at a bookstore." "She lives above a bookstore. She owns the bookstore," Alexander interrupted gently, "and the building it's housed in, and 3 other properties in the historic district, if I'm not mistaken." Sophie watched her family's faces cycle through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and dawning recognition. Their entire understanding of her place in the world was being systematically dismantled by a man they'd known for less than an hour. "Sophie," Charles's voice was carefully controlled, "is this true?" She could lie, she could deflect, minimize, explain away Alexander's knowledge as a misunderstanding or case of mistaken identity. She'd spent years perfecting the art of invisible success, of building an empire while letting everyone assume she was struggling to pay rent. But Alexander was looking at her with something that might have been encouragement, and for the first time in her adult life, Sophie was tired of hiding. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true." "Holy shit!" Hunter breathed, his vocal modulators failing to disguise his shock. "Sophie, you're telling us you own a multi-million-dollar business?" "I'm telling you, I work in rare manuscript acquisition and authentication," Sophie said. "The financial details aren't really relevant to family dinner." But they were relevant, and everyone at the table knew it. In their world of quantified success and broadcast achievements, financial details were the only details that mattered. "How?" Vivian's question came out sharper than she probably intended. "How is this possible? You never said anything. You live in a studio apartment. You drive that ancient Honda." "I live simply because I choose to," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "And I don't broadcast my business because I prefer privacy to performance." The comment hit its target. Around the table, her family, all of whom built their identities around public displays of success, absorbed the implicit criticism. Alexander was watching the interplay with obvious fascination, like an anthropologist studying some previously unknown social ritual. "This is remarkable," Marcus said, his investment banker instincts finally engaging. "Sophie, what kind of volume are we talking about? Annual revenue? Asset portfolio?" "Marcus," Vivienne warned, but her husband's financial curiosity was fully activated. "No, this is important," Marcus continued. "If Sophie's been operating at this level without anyone knowing, that suggests either extraordinary discretion or extraordinary success," Alexander finished smoothly. "The kind that doesn't need to advertise itself." He turned to Sophie, his expression warm with something that looked dangerously like admiration. "Beauty, brains, and business acumen," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that seemed to vibrate through Sophie's neural pathways. "That's a dangerous combination." The sexual tension in the room became so thick that even Patricia's social optimization algorithms seemed to short-circuit. Vivian actually blushed, her adaptive dress shifting from golden amber to deep rose in response to her emotional state. Hunter's bio-enhanced features were cycling through a series of micro-expressions as his neural crown struggled to recalibrate his approach to this new reality. The woman he'd been condescending to all evening had just revealed herself to be more successful than he was. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperate calculation. "Wait, Sophie. This is incredible. I mean, I always knew you were smart, but this changes everything. We should talk about synergies, opportunities. My development projects could really benefit from someone with your expertise in cultural assets." Sophie looked at Hunter, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. The enhanced features, the artificial charisma, the desperate need to be the most important person in any room. 3 minutes ago, he'd been mocking her romantic prospects. Now he was trying to position himself as her potential business partner. "Hunter," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that surprised even her. "I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to work with people who respect both books and the people who read them." The rebuke was delivered so smoothly, so calmly, that it took a moment for its full impact to register. When it did, Hunter's enhanced features couldn't quite mask his shock at being so elegantly dismissed. Alexander's smile was pure appreciation. "Perfectly said." He stood, extending his hand to Sophie with a gesture that somehow managed to be both gallant and proprietary. "Sophie, would you mind showing me your rare book collection? I have a feeling there's a great deal more to discover about your work." The invitation was loaded with romantic and professional promise. Around the table, Sophie could feel her family's collective recognition that the evening's power dynamics had just shifted fundamentally. She took Alexander's hand, noting how perfectly her fingers fit against his palm, and stood with a grace that felt entirely natural. "I'd be delighted," she said, "though I should warn you, my tastes are quite eclectic." "I'm counting on it." As they moved toward the door, Alexander turned back to the stunned family with the kind of smile that suggested he was enjoying this immensely. "Oh, Charles, about that business opportunity we discussed in Geneva. I believe Sophie's company might be interested in acquiring the Lancaster Properties building downtown. Something about expanding her artist community project?" The words hit the room like a final revelation, the capstone to an evening of impossible discoveries. Sophie Lancaster, the family failure, the harmless librarian, the woman they'd spent years treating like a charity case, had just revealed herself to be not only successful beyond their wildest assumptions, but potentially powerful enough to buy their own family business. "Shall we?" Alexander offered Sophie his arm with the kind of old-world courtesy that made the gesture seem both romantic and possessive. Sophie looked back at her family, Charles's shock, Patricia's calculation, Vivian's professional assessment, Hunter's desperate confusion, and smiled. "Lead the way," she said. As they left the dining room together, Sophie heard Patricia's voice behind them, bright with forced cheer. "Well, this has certainly been an evening of surprises." But Sophie was already thinking ahead to the conversation she was about to have with Alexander Hartwell, to the questions he would ask, and the answers she might finally be willing to give. For the first time in her life, she was walking away from a family gathering as an equal. No, as something more than equal. As someone whose true worth had finally been recognized. The sensation was intoxicating. The law offices of Morrison, Chen and Associates occupied 3 floors of Neo-Boston's legal district, their smart glass windows programmed to project authority through subtle amber lighting and holographic displays of the firm's most prestigious cases. Sophie sat in the waiting area's vintage leather chair, real leather, not synthesized, and watched her family arrange themselves according to their established hierarchy. Charles commanded the central position, his bio-enhanced presence radiating the confident expectation of inheritance. Patricia flanked him, her social media implants discreetly recording what would undoubtedly become content about gracefully handling family transitions. Vivian and Marcus occupied the power couple seats, their combined credentials creating a soft glow of professional competence. Hunter paced near the windows, his neural crown flickering as he ran calculations on his expected inheritance and its potential applications to his development projects. 3 days had passed since the dinner revelation, and the family dynamics remained in careful suspension. They'd all been polite to Sophie since learning about midnight literary acquisitions, but it was the cautious politeness of people reassessing a situation they'd previously considered resolved. No one had quite figured out how to integrate this new information into their understanding of family hierarchy. Sophie had spent those 3 days fielding encrypted messages from her business partner in London, finalizing the authentication of a Byzantine manuscript collection, and trying to process what had happened with Alexander. He'd spent 2 hours in her private office above the bookstore, examining her rare acquisitions with the kind of focused appreciation that made her neural implants register elevated stress responses. Professional interest, she'd told herself, though his goodbye had lingered several seconds longer than strictly necessary. The Lancaster family? A woman emerged from the inner offices, mid-40s, silver neural crown indicating senior partner status, her business attire optimized for commanding respect without ostentation. Sophie recognized the type, someone who'd built their success on competence rather than connections. "I'm Elena Morrison, thank you all for coming on such short notice." Her gaze swept the family with the kind of professional assessment that missed nothing. "Before we begin, I should mention that Mrs. Lancaster's will contains some unusual provisions. She was very specific about the order of revelation." Charles straightened, his enhanced posture radiating readiness to assume leadership responsibilities. "Of course." Victoria was always thorough. "Indeed." Morrison's expression remained neutral. "If you'll follow me." The conference room was a study in controlled elegance: mahogany table, holographic displays showing the Lancaster family tree and business holdings, chairs programmed to optimal comfort settings for each individual's biometric profile. Morrison took her position at the head of the table, a stack of physical documents beside her tablet interface. "Mrs. Lancaster's will," she began, "reflects a lifetime of careful observation and consideration. She was particularly interested in authentic achievement versus inherited expectations." Sophie felt a chill of premonition. Victoria had been watching them all more carefully than anyone realized. Morrison activated a holographic display showing Victoria's business empire in all its glory: properties, investments, liquid assets, totaling just over $52 million after taxes and fees. Around the table, Sophie could feel her family's collective intake of breath. "The bulk of the estate," Morrison continued, "including Lancaster properties and all associated holdings, has been left to the family member Mrs. Lancaster felt best embodied the values she wished to perpetuate." Charles leaned forward slightly, his bio-enhanced features arranged in an expression of humble readiness to accept responsibility. However, Mrs. Lancaster was very specific about the reasoning behind her decisions. She recorded a personal message to be played before the inheritance details are revealed. The holographic display shifted, and suddenly Victoria was there. Not a memory loop or archived footage, but a direct recording made in the final weeks of her life. She looked older than Sophie remembered, but her eyes were sharp as quantum processors. "My dear family," Victoria's voice filled the room with the same authority she'd wielded in life. "If you're watching this, then I've moved on to whatever comes next, and you're gathered to discover what I've left behind." Her image turned slightly, as if looking directly at each of them in turn. "I've spent my final months observing you all carefully, watching how you live, how you treat others, how you define success and worth. Some of what I discovered pleased me greatly, some did not." Patricia's social media implants flickered. She was fighting the urge to record this moment, recognizing that some things were too private for public consumption. "Charles, you've built on what I created, expanded it, made it profitable, but you've also made it cold. You see employees as resources and family members as potential liabilities to be managed." Charles's enhanced features couldn't quite mask his shock. This wasn't the grateful recognition of his stewardship he'd expected. "Patricia, your gift for social influence is remarkable, but you've forgotten that influence without substance is just noise. You've turned our family name into a brand and yourself into a performance." Patricia's perfectly regulated expression cracked slightly. Around the table, everyone sat in stunned silence as Victoria delivered her posthumous assessments. Those who refuse forfeit their claims entirely. Sophie looked around the table at her family, really looked at them. Charles, the business leader who'd never led anything toward a purpose beyond profit. Patricia, the influencer who'd influenced people toward nothing but consumption. Vivian, the lawyer who'd learned to serve wealth instead of justice. Hunter, the developer who'd developed nothing but his own ego. They weren't bad people, Sophie realized. They were just people who'd lost their way in a world that rewarded performance over authenticity, display over depth. "I need some air," Sophie said, standing abruptly. The weight of inheriting not just wealth but responsibility for her family's future felt crushing. She made it to the building's rooftop garden before the tears came, not tears of joy or triumph, but tears of overwhelming recognition of what Victoria had entrusted to her. The city spread out below, 8 million people pursuing their versions of success and happiness, most of them measuring their worth by metrics that ultimately meant nothing. "Sophie." She turned to find Alexander emerging from the rooftop access, his expression concerned. "How did you—" "Charles called me. He thought you might need support." Alexander approached carefully, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. "I was in the building anyway. Morrison, Chen handles some of my business interests." Of course he was. Sophie almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. "Congratulations," he said simply. "Though you look like someone who's just inherited a burden rather than a fortune." "Maybe both." Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, grateful that her neural crown's emotional regulation was offline. She wanted to feel this fully, even if it hurt. Alexander moved to stand beside her at the garden's railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Victoria was remarkable," he said after a moment. She understood something most people miss, that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming extraordinary. "Is that what this is? Revenge?" "No." Alexander turned to face her, his expression serious. "This is justice." There's a difference. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city pulse with the endless rhythm of human ambition and desire. "What happens now?" Sophie asked. "Now you decide what kind of leader you want to be, what kind of family you want to have, what kind of legacy you want to build." Sophie thought about her family downstairs, probably still processing the revelation that their dismissive little cousin was now their benefactor and boss. She thought about Victoria's trust, about the businesses and properties and responsibilities she'd inherited. She thought about the community she could build, the artists she could support, the values she could demonstrate. "I have an idea," she said slowly, "but I'll need help." Alexander's smile was warm with promise. "I thought you'd never ask." The Lancaster Community Arts Centre rose from the historic district like a testament to what could be built when vision met resources. Sophie stood in the main gallery, watching volunteers hang artwork for the grand opening celebration, and marvelled at how much could change in 3 months. The centre occupied what had once been a forgotten textile warehouse, its brick walls now housing artist studios, performance spaces, a rare book library, and classrooms where anyone could learn everything from digital sculpture to ancient bookbinding techniques. The renovation had been completed in record time, fueled by unlimited funding and the kind of passionate commitment that money couldn't buy. "The caterers are asking about the wine selection." Sophie turned to find Patricia approaching with a tablet interface, her appearance transformed in ways that had nothing to do with bio-enhancements. She wore simple clothes, actual fabric, not adaptive materials, and her expression carried a warmth that seemed to come from within rather than from social optimization algorithms. "Whatever you think is appropriate," Sophie said. "You have better taste in these things than I do." It was true. Patricia's 3 months coordinating literacy programs had reconnected her with the social skills that had made her genuinely influential. Before she'd become obsessed with manufactured celebrity, she'd thrown herself into the centre's opening with the kind of focused energy she'd once reserved for building her personal brand. I never thought I'd say this, Patricia said, reviewing the tablet, but I'm having more fun planning this party than I had at any of those charity galas. There's something different about celebrating something you've actually built. Through the gallery windows, Sophie could see Charles directing the installation of a sculpture garden, his enhanced physique put to practical use as he helped position pieces created. Tonight belongs to her vision, her values, and her courage to show us what we could become. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks as the attention focused on her. Public speaking had never been her strength. She preferred to let her work speak for itself. But looking around the room at the community she'd helped create, she found the words coming naturally. 6 months ago, she began, I thought success meant hiding your achievements so others wouldn't feel diminished by them. I thought family meant accepting your role in hierarchies you didn't choose. I thought love meant settling for people who saw you as a project to be improved rather than a person to be celebrated. Her eyes found Alexander near the back of the crowd, his expression warm with the kind of attention that had changed everything. I was wrong about all of it. She gestured around the room, at the artwork and the artists, at her family and the community they'd built together. Real success isn't quiet or loud, it's useful. Real family isn't about hierarchy, it's about helping each other become the best versions of ourselves. And real love. She paused, meeting Alexander's gaze across the crowded room. Real love sees you clearly and chooses you anyway. The applause that followed felt like validation, but Sophie was already moving through the crowd toward Alexander. He met her halfway, his smile carrying layers of meaning she was finally ready to explore. Quite a speech, he said when they found a quiet corner near the rare book library. Though I notice you avoided mentioning your grandmother's role in all this. Some stories are too complex for public consumption. Sophie looked around at the celebration, at the life she'd built from authenticity and determination. Besides, Victoria got what she wanted. She got us to become the family we were capable of being. And what did you get? The question was simple, but Sophie heard the deeper layers beneath it. What had she gained by finally claiming her worth, by refusing to hide her achievements, by demanding the respect she'd always deserved? Everything, she said simply. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his enhanced physiology, close enough to see the way his pupils dilated when he looked at her. I finished Love in the Time of Cholera, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made her neural implants register elevated stress responses. And you were right about Florentino. He wasn't pathetic, he was patient. He spent 50 years becoming worthy of the love he'd found. Alexander's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with the kind of natural ease that suggested they'd been designed to fit together. Some people are worth waiting for. And some people, Sophie said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing, are worth everything. When Alexander kissed her, it was against the backdrop of everything she'd built. The community centre humming with creative energy, her family finally functioning as partners rather than competitors. The life she'd constructed from authenticity and courage, and refusal to accept other people's limitations. The kiss tasted like possibility, like the kind of love that saw clearly and chose completely, like the future she'd never dared to imagine when she was hiding in libraries and letting others define her worth. When they broke apart, the celebration continued around them, artists discussing their work, community members planning collaborations, her family serving others with the kind of joy that came from purpose rather than performance. So, Alexander said, his forehead resting against hers in the kind of casual intimacy that felt like coming home. What's next for the mysterious Sophie Lancaster? Sophie looked around at the life she'd built, at the community she'd created, at the family she'd transformed through patience and example rather than confrontation and force. She thought about Victoria's letter, about the responsibility of authentic leadership, about the endless possibilities that opened up when you stopped hiding your light and started using it to illuminate the path for others. Everything, she said again, and this time the word felt like a promise rather than a revelation. The Lancaster Community Arts Centre thrived around them, testament to what could be built when vision met resources, when authentic values trumped material display, when family meant partnership rather than hierarchy. And in the quiet corner of her rare book library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries and the living energy of creation, Sophie Lancaster danced slowly with the man who'd seen her worth before knowing her wealth, understanding finally that the best revenge was never about getting even. It was about becoming extraordinary. The celebration continued late into the night, but Sophie had already found what she was looking for: a family that valued substance over spectacle, a community built on authentic purpose, and a love that saw her completely and chose her anyway. She'd started the story hiding in a library during Victoria's funeral, invisible and underestimated. She ended it dancing at the center of her own celebration, surrounded by everything she'd built from authenticity, patience, and the quiet power of refusing to accept other people's limitations. The transformation was complete. Epilogue. 1 year later, Sophie stood in Victoria's former office, now her office, reviewing the quarterly reports from Lancaster Properties and its new subsidiary, the Lancaster Community Development Corporation. The numbers were impressive: profits up 30%, employee satisfaction at record highs, community investment expanding to 3 additional cities. Authenticity, it turned out, was excellent for business. Through the smart glass windows, she could see the city spreading toward the horizon, 8 million people pursuing their versions of success and happiness. Some of them were still measuring their worth by metrics that ultimately meant nothing. But an increasing number were discovering that true wealth came from what you enabled others to achieve. Her neural crown chimed with an incoming message from Alexander, who was in London finalising the acquisition of a manuscript collection that would anchor the centre's new medieval studies programme. Missing You, found something you'll appreciate, a previously unknown sonnet sequence that I think might change how we understand courtly love poetry. Also found something else I think you'll appreciate. See Attachment. A star. Sophie opened the attachment and found herself looking at a holographic image of a small velvet box. Even through the digital interface, she could tell it contained something that sparkled. Her neural implants registered elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, and the kind of full-body excitement she'd learned to associate with life-changing possibilities. Some stories, Sophie realized, were just beginning. Outside her office, the Lancaster Community Arts Centre prepared for another day of enabling creativity, fostering connection, and proving that the most valuable things couldn't be quantified by algorithms or displayed in status projections. And in the quiet of her grandmother's former sanctuary, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations and the living energy of love, Sophie Lancaster smiled and began planning her next extraordinary adventure. The future, like the best rare books, was worth waiting for,